History as it happens, February 9th, 2023. Hurricane of lies.
There is a small, closely knit group of administration Democrats who are now the complete prisoners and under the complete domination of the bureaucratic, communistic Frankenstein which they themselves have created. To call them Democrats is an insult to the millions of loyal American Democrats. They shouldn't be called Democrats. They should be referred to properly as the Commie-crat Party.
A new biography of Joseph McCarthy illuminates the destructive power of lies, told by a demagogue to ruin others. Lies that find a receptive audience in an age of paranoia, amplified by news media that publish the charges true or not. In our own age of disinformation, McCarthyism still has plenty to teach us. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
A lot of people close to him, even friends, said it was a game. They didn't just mean anti-communist, but just his existence.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Two moments in the career of Joe McCarthy may define him above all others. February 9th, 1950, exactly 73 years ago. He gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he claimed he had a list of more than 200 known communists in the U.S. government. The Wisconsin Republican had been in the Senate since 1947, but he wasn't known for red baiting yet. This speech, for which no audio survives, put him on the anti-communist map. The other defining moment I'm talking about is his downfall, the Army McCarthy hearings, televised for 36 days in the spring of 1954. The demagogue who had spent years getting away with baseless lies that destroyed his fellow Americans' lives finally went too far. Here's his unforgettable exchange with the Army's attorney Joseph Welch after McCarthy tried to tar one of Welch's colleagues as having ties to a communist organization.
I just give this man's record, and I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
And you know, if you watch these old clips at cspan.org, sitting next to McCarthy is a young Roy Cohn, his chief counsel, who would become one of Donald Trump's most important mentors. Now, that's not the only connection between past and present. Connections we'll get into with historian Rick Fried, the author of A Genius for Confusion, Joseph R. McCarthy and the Politics of Deceit. It is the first cradle-to-grave biography of McCarthy I've read, and it doesn't mention anything about our current woes until the very end. What I learned from reading it is just how much McCarthy lied. Yes, I think we all know he never found any actual communists or spies in the State Department or anywhere else in government, although he tried.
This is pretty serious. Have we had anything as serious as this so far?
Oh, yes, I think we've got something much more serious right now.
Well, I'm talking about prior to this hearing.
May I answer that question, Mr. Chairman? I think we've got a much more serious situation now in communist infiltration of the CIA. Disturbs me beyond words.
Well, we haven't. The members of the committee have not been advised, and I do think that...
Oh, yes, they have. Oh, yes, they have.
Have we, the names and of the people...
I've discussed this matter with the members of the committee. I've also discussed with the members of the committee the question of communist infiltration of atomic and hydrogen bomb plants.
But he made no effort to ever get his facts straight, and he went after everyone. Truman, Eisenhower, George Marshall, Dean Acheson, even Edward R. Murrow.
For the record, let's consider briefly some of the senator's charges. He claimed, but offered no proof, that I had been a member of the industrial workers of the world. That is false. I was never a member of the IWW, never applied for membership. Men that I worked with in the Pacific Northwest in western Washington and logging camps will attest that I never had any affiliation or affinity with that organization.
So there is no Joe McCarthy in the U.S. Senate today. We're not living through another Red Scare, and the Soviet Union is long gone. But we are living in an age of disinformation, when legacy media struggle to deal with such a disruptive, dishonest force as Donald Trump.
When the World Trade Center came tumbling down, and I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
And we also live at a time, as we all know, when the internet makes it possible for anyone to spread nonsense across the globe. But this is not merely a Trump problem. As the former president's defenders are quick to point out, the Columbia Journalism Review's expose on Russiagate shows the mainstream press got so much of that story wrong. And they would say that Trump's opponents, like California Democrat Adam Schiff, use the media to amplify falsehoods. Here's Schiff on MSNBC in 2017.
But there is more than circumstantial evidence now. So, again, I think...
So you have seen direct evidence of collusion?
I don't want to go into specifics, but I will say that there is evidence that is not circumstantial and is very much worthy of investigation. So that is what we ought to do.
And on CBS's Face the Nation in 2018.
Congressman, before we go any farther, because I want to draw a distinction, since we've been saying here that some of the facts can get muddled here in the president's language. I want to make sure we're being precise in our conversation. Can you agree that there has been no evidence of collusion, coordination, or conspiracy that has been presented thus far between the Trump campaign and Russia?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight.
Now, I am not saying Adam Schiff is Joseph McCarthy, of course. The point is, during times of heightened national angst, people are susceptible to believing the worst about their political enemies. And as in McCarthy's era, it can take time, to say the least, for the media to correct false reports if they ever get around to it at all. McCarthy understood that he could bombard the newspapers with a hurricane of lies, and by the time anyone could debunk his claim, he'd be on to the next one, front-page news all over again. In such a set of circumstances, powerful demagogues thrive on making it impossible to sort truth from fiction. Rick Fried, hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
So I want to say that when I picked up your book, I did ask the very question that you begin your book with. Another biography of Joe McCarthy? Do we really need this? I would say yes, right? It's never a bad time to reassess or revisit this period in American history because it is still relevant. But anyway, why did you write the book?
Well, it's been a fixation with me. I should confess that I grew up in Milwaukee. So McCarthy's heyday was my young teen years. And I can remember walking home extra fast after school to see if I could catch the end of the televised Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. So Joe and I go back a long way. The other thing is that there have been a lot of new sources that have opened up. McCarthy's own papers, not the Senate stuff. Larry Tye was the first person to get into those. And I've looked at some of them, but just McCarthy's regular stuff from starting in the late 30s up to his Senate years was very revealing. Nobody made much use of those. The other thing that struck me is how many sources there were from the world of journalism. One of the things that's a little different about my book is that there's so much use of the print press, radio, TV people, and so on. The other thing, of course, is that as the Trump era began, I thought knowing about McCarthy is going to help me understand Trump.
Obviously, you didn't plan this book for the Trump era. You started working on it before Donald Trump became a candidate for the presidency.
Right.
But we're living in an age of disinformation, it is said. So McCarthy is relevant.
And actually, seeing Trump taught me more about McCarthy, I think. I mean, it went both ways.
That's interesting because you don't mention Trump until you're afterward. Very end of the book. You didn't want people distracted, I guess.
That's true. I thought that would actually ruin the book.
So before we get into the history here, I do have a question about your personal story. You said you were a teenager. You ran home to catch the end of the McCarthy hearings. What did you think of him? Were you a fan?
No, I wasn't. And I would say neither were my parents, neither was, let's say, the majority of their social group. I mean, there were a few people, few friends of theirs that were very pro-Joe, but I think the majority were critical. And actually, I went to a very small school, and almost everybody there was a Republican. And I remember a mock election we had in 1952, which must have been 5th or 6th grade. We included the presidency, and of course, Eisenhower was a runaway winner. McCarthy lost to a not very well-known Democratic challenger in this mock election.
Well, there were Democratic anti-communists and Republican anti-communists, but many of them did not like Joe McCarthy's approach to anti-communism.
That's right. Obviously, they thought he went too far. Truman is a good example. A lot of people blame the so-called McCarthy era on Truman and would say, why don't we call it the Truman era? Because he established the loyalty program in 1947. The Democrats, not so much Truman, red-baited Henry Wallace in the 1948 election. I mean, there are a lot of people who say that much of the responsibility lies with the Democrats. And I would say some does. But I think that McCarthyism really stems from the dynamic of the two-party situation after 1948, when Dewey manages to lose the White House for the Republicans for the 5th straight time. And there's a lot of desperation. And McCarthy comes along, and the famous statement that's attributed to Taft in early 1950 as McCarthy is getting going is he should try one case, and if one case doesn't work, he should try another. And this is Taft, who's pretty long on character, as opposed to being an opportunist of the McCarthy sort.
He tried to keep his distance from McCarthy to the extent possible without denouncing him, of course. Well, you just raised a very important question about history. Had Dewey won in 48, would we have had a McCarthy era? Probably so, but maybe not the same way. What is your conclusion on that?
I would think so. I mean, you can't factor out the fact that there is a communist problem. There is a Cold War. It's not all Harry Truman's fault, certainly. It's not all the United States' fault. There is a Soviet Union.
There were Red Scares from time to time, and that dealt with domestic communism. I think all parties were concerned about the Soviet Union. It was the connection to domestic communism that McCarthy really put his stamp on.
Right, exactly. He had a foreign policy, one could say, but it was secondary, and at times it appears to be a joke. This is in 1950. He's becoming popular and he's getting a lot of speaking gigs. And he says, well, here's the situation. In 1945, we were so strong, we should have just kept going right into Russia, over the Urals, across to the Pacific, with time to clean up Korea. And that would have been that. And of course, that's ludicrous.
He was not a deep thinker. So as I read your book, the parts of McCarthy's career and legacy I was most familiar with are the parts that most people know, the Army McCarthy hearings and his downfall. I did not know much about his childhood and his early political career before he went to Washington. I didn't know much about the Malmedy business. We'll get to that in a minute. His youth, his early politics, I was trying to find signs of what he would become. And it wasn't apparent to me that he would wind up this way. He wasn't raised to be an anti-communist fanatic, right? And his background,
no, he wasn't.
And his background in politics before winning the Senate seat was he was a local judge. So it wasn't an ideology thing, but there were signs of what he would become when it came to having a flair for the dramatic, exaggeration, glad-handing, cultivating allies, engaging in ethically dubious practices.
He learned early that he could get away with a lie. This is not something original that I've thought of myself, but the 1939 race for state district court judge, he was able to lie about his age, and that may not have been what won the election for him, but he got away with it. The other side would protest, saying, the judge is not 73, 66. McCarthy would say, well, if he's going to keep raising the age issue, what am I supposed to do? And of course, it was McCarthy who was raising it.
Yeah, he had a talent for double talk or for blaming others for something he had said. As you put it in your title, he was a genius for confusion. He was able to muddy the waters, and before you were able to figure out one lie, and this again goes to even before he came to Washington, although of course it intensified after that point. Before you could figure out one lie, he was on to the next.
As somebody said at the time, the lie could travel around the world before the truth had a chance to put its pants on.
One other point of comparison. I mean, today everyone expects politicians to lie. In the 1940s, did people tend to believe what politicians said?
I think more so. Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I tried to deal with was the political culture of Wisconsin. And of course, prior to McCarthy, prior to the 40s, it was controlled by the progressives who had begun under the senior fighting Bob LaFollette as a kind of a splinter of the Republican Party. And then in the 1930s, his two sons, Bob Jr. and Phil, created a third party. And one of the old progressives that I talked to said, you know, somebody would make a charge against young Bob LaFollette, and his people would say, well, let's wait till Bob comes around and he'll tell us what actually is happening. They had greater credence. And I think that's not just progressives.
Yeah, I mentioned before how I was reading the early chapter of your book about his upbringing and then his early political career as a judge. I was trying to find, what issues mattered to him. And it wasn't clear he had an overarching cause when he went to the Senate in 46. Individual issues could be important to him, but he didn't seem, as strange as this may sound, to be an ideologue.
No, that's correct, I think. And there were people who said, he's actually on the progressive side of the Republican Party. On some issues, that's true. There was a chance that he could have been the sort of knight on a white horse for the issue of housing at a time when veterans were coming home and having to live in Quonset huts and streetcars. Of course, he comes from a farm state, and he's very much pro-farm subsidy. There's a point when he wants to have a parity level for farmers' price supports that goes beyond what anyone else wanted. The reason he becomes he's always an anti-communist, but most people were. The reason he becomes a professional one is he saw that very quickly that it worked. He was shocked in the early months of 1950 at how quickly his charges got out in the media and people started writing in saying, way to go, Joe, and sending $5 bills and things like that.
And not just any anti-communist, a McCarthyite. McCarthyism, rather, was coined during his career. That didn't come later. So people identified an ism. But
he said that the Daily Worker invented that term, but in fact it was the Washington Post cartoonist Herblock as early as March.
You mean he lied?
Yes, I'm shocked.
Yeah, but his critique of communism was not based on a real understanding of Leninism, Marxism, or economics, right? He had a different approach to anti-communism that was, in a sense, the way Donald Trump looks at the establishment today. It was anti-establishment.
He didn't have a profound ideological understanding of or loathing of communism. I mean, he loathed it, but he actually thought that the typical communist was mentally ill. It's kind of an interesting variation on what other anti-communists were doing. And the one thing that can be said quite positively for him, I think, is that unlike Trump, among others, he's not a nativist. And of course, his famous speech at Wheeling and variations of it, he says it's not our cliche version of the communist, shaggy, bomb-throwing aliens. It's young men who've been born with a silver spoon in their mouths.
Alger Hiss.
Exactly. Yeah, and of course, Dean Acheson, whom he didn't accuse of communism, but just of being wrong-headed, soft on it. Acheson's another example of the aristocracy.
Well, there was the issue, though, of how much of a true believer he was. And you come down on the side that he became one. He wasn't at first, and contemporaries made this observation. He doesn't care about this issue. He just uses it for his own political platform. But he did become a true believer? I mean, is it possible to know for sure? Because you didn't psychoanalyze him in your book.
No, and people have tried with varying degrees of success, and there's nobody's been able to come up with any clear sense of what was quote, wrong with him. I don't think he was a true believer. I think he was a true believer in McCarthy as an anti-communist. He believed his sense of identity became wrapped up in Joe the Crusader, the knight errant of communism, going around answering these speech invitations and going out and telling people the, in quotes, truth. He was committed to the Church of Joe McCarthy, basically.
Because he didn't really go after communists. If he was really concerned about this issue, he might have gone after real spies, because we know, maybe not at the time, right? Because the Venona transcripts weren't available. But
that's right.
He went after people who were harmless.
He went after small fry, mostly.
Yeah, and he was using old material, right? People had already been named in other contexts.
All his lists, whether it's the 205, whether it's the 108, whether it's the 81, they all come from other people's digging. The 205, which he said were known pro-communists, that list was simply people back in 1946 in the State Department about whom there was one question or another.
They may have written an article years before or was a member of a group that was sympathetic to communism. Let's return to those critical years in a moment, because when I read your book, I learned of an episode I had no idea that this happened. I'm referring to the Malmedy war crimes trials. So in World War II, the Waffen-SS in France massacred American soldiers. There were a number of massacres of prisoners of war. So they weren't taken prisoner, they were killed. And these Germans were later tried after the war by American occupation authorities, correct? And they were held in prison pending trial, and they were all, I think almost all of them were convicted, some of them sentenced to death. And there were allegations that these were sham trials, that the prisoners were tortured, etc., that it was a miscarriage of justice. And McCarthy gloms onto this. He made a comment, and I'll let you pick it up from here, that the way the U.S. treated these German prisoners was as bad as anything Hitler had done. I mean, incredible.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. There are a lot of different theories, none of which has been nailed down as to what possessed him to get into this. He's got a very strong German segment of the population of his state. Did that have something to do with it? He was influenced by some local editors with whom he was friendly in Appleton, who were anti-war. They were certainly anti-war against Germany. There's also some people at the time theorized that some of his financial backers in Wisconsin were German, well, actually of German origin and pro-German. I don't know. I think he was just looking for something. This slant on German policy goes back previous to Malmedy in 1949. You know, he was making remarks in 1946 that we're allowing the French to use German POWs as slave labor, which we were, one could say. But one could also argue that the Germans that were held captive in prison during the Malmedy trials were not mistreated by and large.
Yeah, there was an investigation that was done that basically found, they were treated well enough. I mean, they're prisoners.
And of course, McCarthy would say, well, that's all fake.
Fake news before we use that term.
Don't be rude. Attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude. No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you stay categorically?
You are fake news.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, he basically made it impossible, as Trump did during his presidency, to believe anyone.
There are those who say that the man who led the investigation that McCarthy sabotaged, if you will, Ray Baldwin, who was a Republican senator from Connecticut. And of course, it was a tribute to how much he was admired by his colleagues that a Democratic Senate put him in charge of this subcommittee. McCarthy would say, no, that's all part of the plot. McCarthy essentially helped drive Baldwin out of public life. He was given a chance to take up a state-level Supreme Court justiceship, and he took it. He found Washington just too unpleasant. And Richard Rovere, who wrote the first post-McCarthy biography, said that McCarthy circulated, and I tried to track this down and could not, McCarthy circulated the vilest rumors about Baldwin in Washington that Rovere claims that's what drove Baldwin back to Connecticut.
There was nothing benign about this. We were talking about whether McCarthy actually believed what he was saying. He was vindictive. He wanted to settle scores, whether these people are communists or not. I mean, actually, there was a lull there. You point this out when he becomes chairman, the beginning of the end, right? When he becomes chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in the Senate after the 52 elections, when Republicans are now in control of that chamber. He didn't go after communists right away. He basically used his platform to attack his enemies or people who criticized him.
Right. Some of the pettiest fee sharing by a man named Edward Morgan, who had been chief counsel of the Tidings subcommittee that investigated McCarthy's charges in 1950. He goes after Morgan publicly. He also goes after him, we could say, privately, spreading rumors, because Morgan by now has a law practice, and McCarthy tried to ruin him.
Well, as I mentioned, I've always found it fascinating about demagogues, whether they believe what they're saying and eventually maybe come to believe it in a certain sense because they're along for the ride and they get carried away with their own fame, right? When it comes to lying, which is such an integral part of the McCarthy story, all people lie, let alone politicians. Some lies are harmless. Did you drink the last beer in the fridge? Oh, no, that wasn't me. Some people lie, like politicians, to wriggle out of a jam, right, or to cover up a previous lie. Others lie for personal gain, financial, whatever it is. I mean, we have this guy in Congress now, George Santos, who has created a complete fantasy because he was obviously trying to embellish his resume so he could win a seat in Congress. McCarthy was trying to destroy people's reputations, win political power for himself. But it was the intensity of McCarthy's lying and the frequency of it that was just incredible.
You almost wonder if he enjoyed it. And he did enjoy playing with people. And getting back to your point about was he or was he not a true believer, a lot of people close to him, even friends, said it was a game. They didn't just mean anti-communist, but just his existence.
So let's talk about the key years now and draw some parallels to the problems we're having today, especially when it comes to McCarthy's relationship with the media. What was going on in 1949 that created an anti-communist atmosphere?
Well, Eric Goldman said it best in a book he wrote in the 50s. 49 was the year of shocks. Several things happened. China fell to the communists, and there was a sense among some Americans that somebody had to push her for that to happen, for her to fall. The Soviets detonated an A-bomb in the early autumn. We had this sense that Russians were primitive folk and they couldn't have developed this on their own. They had to steal it. Well, they did, in fact, steal good portions of it sped up their program by several years. So you had the fall of China, the Russian A-bomb, and then the two trials of Alger Hiss, one of which ended up with a hung jury and the second of which ended up with a conviction for perjury. He was not convicted as a spy. He was convicted for lying about his past. That all leads into early 1950. And then in January, the pregnant issue is, well, okay, the Russians have the A-bomb and our monopoly is gone. Maybe we better build the H-bomb. And that was scary. And it scared even some rather conservative folk in the Senate who could not be accused of being pro-communist, of saying, whoa, let's sit down with the Russians and talk about this, or let's come up with a global Marshall Plan.
This was pre-arms race these years.
Yes. Yeah. It was an attempt to stop the next level of an arms race. It didn't happen. And, I sometimes think that McCarthy coming on scene and spraying the room with these charges prevented further discussion of that approach.
And in 48, as we mentioned, Dewey loses, so Republicans have now lost 5 consecutive presidential elections. I mean, think about that. So the party is in a state of disarray, at least nationally, right? And then in 1950, the Korean War starts, so another shock because the United States was taken by surprise by that invasion. So we're still a couple of years away from McCarthy at the height of his power. But already in 1950, in the Senate, he starts publicly accusing people of being communists in the U.S. State Department. And there's an investigation of McCarthy, the Tidings investigation. Tidings was a senator from Maryland. The findings were pretty damning. I mean, McCarthy basically lied about everything, but it didn't land a knockout blow, and that was because it was, in the end, partisan, right?
That's right. Tidings was a man of considerable temper, and he let it get away from him. And it became, as McCarthy's backer said, it became an investigation not of communists in the State Department so much as of McCarthy. But of course, it was hard to pin down McCarthy because he kept changing his targets. And you have to feel a little sympathy for Tidings.
And all along here, there were people saying, just don't worry, this guy will eventually fade out. Or if we ignore him, or his lies have been exposed so much that he has no future, right? People continue to underestimate him.
That's right. They had a basis for that given his first 3 years in the Senate, but he had talents, obviously.
And a certain shamelessness.
Yes.
Yes, some people caught in a public lie, maybe, well, I guess I shouldn't assume anything about politicians. You know, I did skip over the legendary Wheeling speech, of which there is no audio recording. That really is a key turning point here, prior to this 1950 Tidings business. You know, in your book, you really dig deep on this, you know, the provenance of the 205 names or whatever it was. So what happened there? What's the truth about Wheeling?
I wish I knew. There actually was a recording, but it was erased and taped over. The station did
local
that.
Radio station,
And
right.
Both sides, McCarthy and the Tidings people, were poking around. I mean, somebody even put an ad in a West Virginia newspaper saying, hey, you know, some people have a hobby of recording radio speeches, and I'll bet that one of McCarthy a couple months ago would be worth a pretty penny if anyone wanted to turn it in. But it never happened. McCarthy, his text said 205 as the number of members of the Communist Party are aspiring, but he later crossed it out, and he kept shifting as he moved west on Lincoln Day weekend.
81, 57, and different newspapers had different numbers.
That's right.
It was hard to get one authoritative report on what he said, and I guess that raises an issue of the media here, right? Local newspapers, even big city newspapers, were still local sources of news in those days.
Nobody knew who McCarthy was when he went to Wheeling, so the New York Times didn't send a man to cover him. So it all local papers. The editor of the Wheeling Intelligencer didn't think he'd said 205, and there was dispute even, you know, in the editorial rooms down in Wheeling. One possible theory that I played with is if the Democrats had simply ignored him, what would have happened? The State Department has asked for comment, of course, and that's the doing of the press. McCarthy said this, what do you say? And Lincoln White says, well, that's nonsense. And the State Department says if there were any, we'd have them out by day's end or something like that. So there's this ping pong game back and forth. Well, McCarthy responds to the response, and that keeps the ball in the air. You can't control the press. What are they supposed to do?
I was going to ask you, was the press culpable in McCarthy's rise? I mean, there was this idea that they needed to just print what he said because what he said was news.
That's right. I mean, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. If they ignore him, well, then they're suppressing the news, quote unquote. If he said Joe Schmo's a communist, it is a fact that that's what he said. They never figure out a way, and there were a lot of people in journalism who said, you know, we're being taken to the cleaners by this guy. What do we do? Some people suggested you have the McCarthy story in one column and next to it editorial comment, or actually reportorial comment saying, well, we know that Owen Lattimore is not a member of the Communist Party, or we think we know that. But they never got there.
And of course, some newspapers were partisan, so they were pro-McCarthy and they had no interest in vetting what he said, right? The national news wires tried to play it straight, but how many people were reading those national news wires?
Well, the AP, the UPI, and so on, that's what's getting the national news to people in Fargo, North Dakota, I'm thinking. Okay. You can't editorialize going out over the AP. You report that this is McCarthy's latest charge. And if there's a comment from the person that he attacked, you print that, but that's often the next day on page 14.
Right. It takes time to track down the truth, especially if there is no truth behind the McCarthy claim about this person or that. You don't have access to government records in the person's personnel file. You could be on a wild goose hunt because there may be nothing. And McCarthy made this mistake a lot himself. He would just name the wrong person. So right information, wrong person.
Right. There'd be some occasional mix-ups when he gets to Owen Lattimore. There's one story that it's picked up in some of the research that other historians have done. He was going to name Francis Sayre. He was related by marriage to Woodrow Wilson, and he was in the State Department. He was going to be named as McCarthy's #1 case, and somebody went to McCarthy and said, "You can't do that." And so he says, "Okay," and he pulls another file, and that's where Owen Lattimore came from. He carried some of the charges over from the one case to the other, and it didn't fit. I mean, Owen Lattimore is treated as Alger Hiss's boss or something like that.
He treated him terribly.
Nothing of the sort. Yeah.
So what is your verdict then on the press of the McCarthy age? Were they wrong? Because they have been criticized by others. McCarthy quickly understood that he can continue to put out lies, and by the time, as you said, the press got around to debunking it, it would be on page 14, and there'd be a fresh lie on the next day's paper on the front page.
Well, I'm sympathetic to their dilemma. I'm not sure what they could have done. I mean, ignoring him was, well, actually, eventually they did. Once McCarthy is censured, that's kind of that's almost a permission to ignore. And McCarthy would hand out a press release, and people who had covered him for 5 years would say, "Thanks, Joe." And as soon as he left, they put it in the wastebasket. I don't know how they should have handled it, frankly.
Even if they had done a fact check on him every single day, it may not have made a difference to some of his supporters.
And then the other problem is the media were less nationalized, let us say. TV is pretty primitive at that point. Somebody in the Chicago Sun-Times, just to take an example, could do a series of 3 very critical summaries of McCarthy to date. You know, somebody might pick it up and say, "Yeah, that's good, let's print it." But it's not national, so it's not available. And there's a constant people in Wisconsin, especially clustered around the Milwaukee Journal and the Madison Capital Times, they know the skinny on McCarthy. National reporters for the Times or the Washington Post or, lots of papers or magazines would come to Wisconsin, and they'd be surprised by what they found out. And this was public knowledge. It just hadn't spread.
Yeah, newspapers were local entities, even large newspapers.
Right.
People didn't get online in the morning and read the New York Times all over the world in those days.
Exactly.
There's an obvious parallel to today in criticism of the media. In 2015, 2016, as hard as it might be to believe this today, some folks say in those years, Donald Trump got a pass. He got free publicity, and the press should have been calling what he said lies instead of just falsehoods, and that he got away with too much. But as I mentioned, I'm not sure it would have made all that much difference, knowing what we know now.
Every time Trump got away with something, let us say, I would think McCarthy. I mean, in that sense, they were brethren. They had a genius for manipulating the press and making it true that even bad publicity is publicity. It was almost like jujitsu. They could make something out of a hostile press. It kept them in the news.
McCarthy acted as if he believed there was no such thing as bad publicity.
That's right. And McCarthy, I tried to make something of this in the early chapter. He's never been in the advertising business. And some of what he knows about publicity is intuitive. He's always on the watch for how you advertise a product and so on. And I think it's hard to identify exactly where he uses this understanding, but I think he's onto that in the late 1930s.
He's chummy with reporters,
when politics is becoming less person to person. Tom Reeves, who wrote an early biography of McCarthy, and Edwin Bailey, who was a journalist who wrote about McCarthy in the press, they interviewed a lot of journalists. And a lot of these people would say, I didn't believe a word he said, but he was great company.
In my view, Trump would lie as an attack on the very idea of objective truth itself. Just take day one of his administration with the crowd size thing. Everyone with two eyes could see that the crowd was small. They insisted that it wasn't.
This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe. Even the New York Times printed a photograph showing that a misrepresentation of the crowd in the original tweet in their paper, which showed the full extent of the support, depth, and crowd and intensity that existed.
As if to say, the only truth is the truth that we state here. Did McCarthy take that same tact, or was it different?
There's an exponential difference, and Trump is on the wrong side of the exponent there. I think you're right. Well, actually, when I mentioned once to my graduate school advisor that I was doing McCarthy during the Trump period, he says, well, you're obviously going to have to be thinking about comparisons. And he said, as I see it, McCarthy is the more benign of the two. And I think that's true, the less dangerous.
When did he become a raging alcoholic, and to what extent did that affect all of this stuff?
You can get about 15 different answers to the when. Some people say it was he was always a drinker. Other people would say, no, he'd go to a party and pick up a drink and it was a prop. And some people said, when he got to Washington, maybe it was the availability. I mean, you're a senator, you can go to one cocktail party after another. I think it was as he was coming under increased tension and pressure running the subcommittee. And it's very clear he's got physical problems with it during the censure hearings and also probably during the Army McCarthy hearing. So that takes 1954.
So meaning he was drunk during the hearings?
Yeah, occasionally. I wouldn't say that's a constant. Yeah, there is testimony that he'd come in and he was, Karl Munt, for example, who was chairing those hearings, would say, Joe came in today and he didn't look healthy.
Well, we all know, of course, I don't have any personal experience in this, that when you're inebriated, you say things you may not say when you're sober. So I've often wondered, to what extent did the alcoholism influence the outcome of the McCarthy era?
Well, it's possible that demon rum was what got him in all those combat situations during the Army hearings, especially with Symington picking on Joe Welch and so on. I mean,
that was the famous moment everyone knows, right?
On the other hand, one could say that Welch, who was perfectly sober, was picking in the other direction. And he was needling. I can't rule out the fact that Welch was trying to provoke McCarthy to get to that famous, have you at long last no sense of decency, Senator, when McCarthy attacks the guy in Welch's law firm.
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it hurts.
May I say, Mr. Chairman, as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to finish this.
Senator, I think it hurts you too, sir.
I'd like to finish this. I know Mr. Cohen would rather not have me go into this. I intend to, however, and Mr. Welch talks about any sense of decency. It seems that Mr. Welch is pained so deeply, he thinks it's improper for me to give the record, the Communist Front record, of the man whom he wanted to foist upon this committee.
So he talked a little bit about the press's responsibility. How about Eisenhower? He made a point not to name McCarthy's name even when criticizing the tactics. Should Ike have come out stronger earlier?
I'm sympathetic to the idea of not, Ike's famous comment, I will not get into the down in the gutter with that guy. I think that, since McCarthy is a counterattacker, Ike may have been strategically shrewd to go with his rule not to mention him by name. The one thing that I criticize Eisenhower for is that there's more to McCarthyism than McCarthy, and there's the whole bureaucracy of loyalty and security programs. And Eisenhower was not, if he was aware, he didn't much care that there were people being mangled just by the ordinary workings of this machinery.
He was an anti-communist.
He was, very much so. And so was Truman. Truman let the machinery run a little while too. He may have been a little more sympathetic to civil liberties than Ike, but not much difference.
Well, we have this debate today around Trump, right? Is he really this powerful? Do Republicans have to be so afraid of him? He and his candidates continue to lose elections. This debate was around during McCarthy's time. People believed he was more influential, more powerful than he might have actually been. But, that's easy to say now, I suppose. So to your point about not coming down hard on Eisenhower or others for not more forcefully condemning McCarthy in public, they were afraid.
Bob Griffith wrote a book 50 years ago, and he titled it The Politics of Fear. That was crucial to why McCarthy's colleagues gave him a very wide berth. They didn't want him coming into their state. And the same thing is, of course, quite true today. Now we use it as a verb. You get primaried. McCarthy didn't do too much of that, but the one time that he did, his guy got absolutely clobbered by Margaret Chase Smith in 1954. By that point, of course, McCarthy's power was waning. Again, I would say that Trump's power relative to McCarthy's is exponentially greater.
Trump was the president and still is the most influential, although that might be waning, influential Republican in the country. Just a couple of more items here. We're not living in a new McCarthy age. We don't have radical anti-communists publicly attacking others. There's no figure like McCarthy today in the Senate. What elements of McCarthyism exist today, though?
Again, that phrase, the politics of fear, if it's not communism, it's fear of something. Look at how Trump used the fear of rapists crossing the Rio Grande, that sort of thing. You can always play that game. If that's McCarthyism, we're going to keep having it. You hear the term communism bandied about today, whether it's the program of the current administration. You occasionally hear it red-baited, let's say.
And also the issue of disinformation is really big today. And how to handle people who don't tell the truth on the part of the news media, and also legitimate criticism of the news media for getting things wrong, for instance, in the Russiagate reporting. There's a big Columbia Journalism Review 4-part series on all the incorrect stories. People on the right feel like the Russiagate stuff got way out of control and a hysteria and paranoia set in.
It's always a problem. It assails both sides, I think, in any controversy. Somebody comes to you with a memo that proves what you would like to believe is true about your opponent. You go with it. That hasn't changed.
So nothing is really unprecedented. I told you I'm on a one-man mission to get rid of that word from our public discourse.
Well, that will be unprecedented.
Final note here, and what a paradox, what an irony. Reading from your conclusion. McCarthy had nothing meaningful to add to the ideology of anti-communism, the thing that he is most remembered for.
Well, he wasn't a theoretician. There were lots of people back in his day who could tell you why communism was bad, ranging from politicians to philosophers. And McCarthy had none of that. He just said the typical guy must be a little off in the head. It was a remarkably medicalized sense of what made people communists. That was it. That was his contribution.
You hear that today when politicians accuse people of being either socialists or fascists. What do they actually mean by that? And if you dig deep, they can't even define it.
Right. Yeah, fascism has metastasized lately as a term.
And people were worried about fascism with McCarthy, right? That he was going to bring fascism.
Yeah, although more foreigners than Americans. There were some Americans who were concerned. And there were a lot of, let's say, Weimar refugees who thought that America was safe, but America's got the same problem. And refugees that in Europe, American legislators and officials and potentates of one sort or another would go abroad and people would say, we had Hitler, you have McCarthy. And they didn't understand McCarthy never got to that level.
Yeah, he never had anyone killed, as far as we know, or started a war. Right?
No, right.
Yeah. My final point, then, is another of your observations in your conclusion. There are still people today who try to rehab McCarthy's reputation. Your conclusion is that his legacy basically had no positive aspects to it, right?
That's correct. And yet the notion of McCarthy, the hero, dies hard. There are some people who are still committed to the notion that he could do very little or no wrong.
Or that he was on the right side of the issue, but just had bad methods.
Lyndon Johnson, in his salty way, captured it when he took over as leader in 1953. I will not have the Democratic Party engaged in the debate, resolved anti-communism is good or bad, and have us take the wrong side of that. People were sold on the fact that anti-communism was bad and McCarthy was anti-communist. So what's not to like? The problem, of course, is that most people were anti-communist. The one case that people tried to make, including William F. Buckley in his book with his brother-in-law, Bozell, there's nothing wrong with creating a consensus on the evils of communism. But I think that consensus was pretty well there without McCarthy.
I think we should keep in mind when we refer to Democrats, when we refer to the administration, that there are definitely two groups of Democrats as of today. Number one, there are the millions of loyal Americans who have voted the Democrat tickets. Individuals who are just as loyal, who hate communism just as much, and love America just as much as the average Republican. That's one group. On the other hand, there is that small, closely knit group of administration Democrats who are now the complete prisoners and under the complete domination of the bureaucratic, communistic Frankenstein which they themselves have created.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, former Pakistani president and general Pervez Musharraf has died. We're going to talk about his legacy with Peter Bergen next, as we report History as It Happens, podcast from the Washington Times.